The trouble began on a warm Saturday morning, the kind of morning that made the entire neighborhood look deceptively peaceful. Sunlight stretched across the manicured lawns, and the faint hum of sprinklers echoed across Maple Crest Estates. Everything looked calm from the outside, but beneath that picture-perfect facade was a brewing hostility that had been slowly shaping itself over weeks, or perhaps months. And at the center of it all stood the HOA, rigid and micromanaging, and a neighbor whose pastime had evolved into full-time surveillance of the people around her. The homeowner, who had lived quietly on his corner lot for years, never expected to become the target of such obsessive behavior. His yard was tidy, borderline minimalist, and maintained with more care than many others in the neighborhood. He followed every regulation, every guideline, every vague or overreaching rule that the HOA had ever pushed. He was not the type to stir conflict. He was the type to avoid it. But Maple Crest had a way of testing even the most patient residents. It started subtly. Small glances from the neighbor across the street, the one who had a reputation that stretched far and wide through whispered conversations during HOA gatherings. She had been nicknamed the neighborhood auditor, and not kindly. She documented everything. Where most people saw homes, she saw a checklist. Where most people saw neighbors, she saw potential offenders. And now, for reasons unknown at the time, her attention had zeroed in. The first sign that something was off arrived in the form of a crisp white envelope with the HOA's emblem pressed into the corner. Inside was a violation notice. According to the letter, his yard was in breach of HOA aesthetics due to excessive debris. Specifically, scattered piles of yard trimmings, loose branches, and a tarp that was supposedly left out for days. It was laughable at first, almost absurd, because nothing of the sort had ever occurred. His yard had been immaculate all week, but attached to the notice was a single printed photograph. The image showed his yard in a state of disarray, branches strewn across the grass, patches of overgrown weeds, and what appeared to be a crumpled blue tarp tossed near the driveway. It was undeniably his house, his driveway, his fence. The angle was even one that matched his neighbor's side of the street. But something was wrong. He stared at the picture for several minutes, analyzing every detail. The lighting was inconsistent. The shadows fell at angles that didn't align with the time of day the supposed violation had occurred. The placement of the branches seemed suspiciously unnatural. Then came the unmistakable element. A smear of pixelation, too subtle for casual eyes but blatant to anyone who understood images well enough. The photograph had been altered. The realization washed over him slowly first, then sharply enough to spark a mix of disbelief and anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple mistake. Someone had intentionally manipulated evidence to accuse him of a rule violation. And there was only one person who would do something like that. The neighbor whose eyes followed every lawn mower, every delivery truck, every movement on the street. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. The HOA board had already been notified of the violation. They had already placed the warning in his record, and the letter stated clearly that further action would be discussed at the upcoming meeting. He knew the board had a habit of trusting photographic evidence. They prided themselves on being efficient, even if efficient often meant stubbornly refusing to hear anyone out. Still, he wasn't worried. Not yet, because at the edge of his roof, angled discreetly and purposefully, sat a security camera. He had installed it months earlier after a string of package thefts in the neighborhood. The camera captured footage of his yard day and night, with a motion-triggered archive that stored weeks' worth of recordings. If someone had fabricated a mess in his yard or worse, staged it to take a photograph, he would know. And if they hadn't, then the image was undeniably fake. Either way, the truth lived in that archive. He immediately pulled up the footage from the days mentioned in the violation. Hours of daytime recordings passed on fast forward, showing a perfectly groomed yard. No branches, no tarp, no debris, not even a stray leaf that would raise an eyebrow. His property remained as neat as ever, the grass trimmed, the walkway swept, the driveway empty aside from his car. The falsehood of the accusation grew more obvious with every clip he reviewed. The video showed not only the condition of the yard but the stillness of the area. No one walking across, no one throwing branches around, no suspicious activity whatsoever. The edited photo was nothing but an invention, a synthetic attempt to incriminate him. But the question burned. Why? What pushed the neighbor into such a desperate move? Was it resentment, jealousy, or perhaps a need to assert dominance in the HOA's inner circles? Maple Crest Estates had seen petty behavior before, but fabricating a violation was bold even by their standards. As the meeting approached, word began to spread. Gossip traveled quickly, carried by passing walkers, afternoon gardeners, and retirees who lingered by driveways longer than necessary. The fabricated violation became a whispered topic. Those who believed the image, those who doubted it, and those who suspected foul play but were too afraid to challenge the HOA publicly. Meanwhile, the neighbor who had submitted the photo seemed more confident than ever, standing on her porch with the posture of someone who had a victory already in hand. She didn't need to speak, her demeanor said enough. She believed her submission would hold. She believed the board would take her side. She believed, perhaps, that she had finally caught someone breaking the rules. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her intended target had kept meticulous documentation of his own. The security footage was clear, time-stamped, unedited, irrefutable. It showed the exact truth she had attempted to erase. The homeowner prepared a digital file containing the relevant clips, screenshots, and a timeline. He organized everything with precision, knowing the HOA valued structured presentations. By the time he finished, he felt a calm confidence settle into place. Not the kind that came from arrogance, but from certainty. Certainty that the truth was on his side, and certainty that her lie was about to unravel publicly. As the day of the HOA meeting drew nearer, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. Some residents watched him with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled anticipation, eager to see conflict unfold, because in communities like Maple Crest, drama was as common as lawn decorations. On the evening before the meeting, the sky darkened into an early dusk, and the neighborhood grew quiet. He stood at his window looking out at the street. The neighbor's lights glowed in her living room. She appeared relaxed, unaware of what tomorrow would bring. But he knew the tide was about to turn. The fabricated photo had been the spark. The meeting would be the fire. And the truth, undeniable and captured on camera, was the fuel that would expose everything. He stepped away from the window, ready for what came next. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with a tension that felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down on the entire neighborhood. Maple Crest's community center, usually reserved for holiday decorating sessions and bland potlucks, now carried an atmosphere more akin to a courtroom awaiting a heated trial. The lights were bright, the folding chairs arranged in rigid rows, and the HOA board members took their places behind their long rectangular table with the solemnity of officials facing a crisis. Outside, clusters of neighbors lingered before entering, exchanging theories in hushed tones. Some believed the violation was real, some doubted it, and some, particularly those familiar with the neighbor who had submitted the photo, suspected that the night would unfold very differently than she anticipated. Inside, the homeowner sat prepared, calm, and equipped with a USB drive and neatly printed documents. His nerves were steady, tempered by the certainty of truth. For days he had replayed the footage, double-checked timestamps, and organized the evidence so thoroughly that not even the strictest board member could dismiss it. Across the room sat the neighbor who had sparked it all, perched stiffly with an expression that wavered between pride and impatience. She believed tonight would validate her. She believed the board would commend her vigilance. She believed she had uncovered a genuine violation, one that would strengthen her standing in a community where she secretly craved authority. As the meeting began, the typical formalities dragged on. Budget updates, upcoming maintenance schedules, a brief announcement about holiday decorations. But the tension only grew thicker as everyone waited for the agenda item that had drawn so many residents to attend. Even the board members seemed aware of the atmosphere, flipping through their papers with the cautious anticipation of people expecting conflict. Finally, the chairperson reached the violation review section. A calm silence spread through the room as the fabricated photo was introduced. The board projected the image onto a screen, allowing every resident present to see the alleged mess in the homeowner's yard. Gasps rippled quietly through the group. Some eyebrows rose, some eyes narrowed, and some expressions shifted immediately into suspicion, not toward the homeowner, but toward the image itself. Even those unfamiliar with digital manipulation could sense that something wasn't quite right. The lighting looked odd. The debris seemed staged, and the infamous tarp appeared too crisp, too clean, almost pasted atop the grass. Still, the neighbor sat straight-backed and confident, convinced that her submission held weight. The board thanked her for her vigilance. She nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement as though it were a medal. And then, with the same theatrical calm she always carried, she waited for the board to declare their decision. Sure, they would move straight to a warning or fine. But before they could move forward, the homeowner stood. The room turned toward him, not dramatically, but with the subtle shift of dozens of eyes suddenly alert. He approached the board, handed his documentation to them, and waited as they loaded the security footage. His demeanor remained composed, though underneath the surface, he could feel the slow burn of vindication beginning to form. When the footage began playing on the screen, the atmosphere shifted instantly. What the image had claimed was chaos, the footage directly contradicted. It showed a pristine yard on every day in question, captured from angles impossible to misinterpret. It showed consistency, time-stamped clarity, and the undeniable absence of any debris. The board leaned forward, studying the footage carefully. Members exchanged glances. They paused, rewound, zoomed in. Then they flipped back to the submitted photograph, comparing every detail. And with every passing second, the truth became more obvious. The photo was not a captured moment. It was a manufactured one. Whispers erupted in the room. Some neighbors shook their heads, recognizing immediately that the yard had been framed. Others stared at the neighbor who submitted the photo, their expressions shifting from neutral to skeptical. A few quietly murmured theories. That she had taken the photo from her own yard, that she had used editing tools, that she had finally gone too far in her obsession with policing everyone. The neighbor's composure began to crack. At first it showed in the slight stiffness of her posture, then in the tightening of her jaw, and finally in the darting movement of her eyes as she searched the room for support that was rapidly evaporating. Her confidence drained away as quickly as it had appeared hours earlier. The board, now visibly unsettled, confronted the undeniable truth presented before them. The footage left no room for interpretation. The dates matched, the angles matched, and the absence of any mess was absolute. The photo was not only inaccurate, it was deliberately falsified. For the first time in years, the power dynamic in Maple Crest tilted. The neighbor's reputation, once bolstered by her zealous community watchfulness, now teetered on the edge of collapse. The board members, all too aware that trusting fabricated evidence could damage their credibility, shifted their tone. They spoke with caution, with disappointment, and with an unmistakable undertone of anger. The room felt as though it held its breath, waiting to see how the board would respond. Rarely had anyone been caught attempting to manipulate the HOA's authority. Never had someone presented a falsified image as evidence. And certainly never had someone been exposed so publicly. As the board reviewed the documents again, the murmurs intensified. Some neighbors showed a spark of satisfaction, a sense that justice was unfolding. Others displayed sympathy for the homeowner, realizing how quickly and unfairly the situation could have turned against him if not for his camera system. But most watched with disbelief, unable to fathom the audacity required to fabricate a violation. The neighbor at the center of it all sat frozen, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet panic. She had built her influence in the neighborhood through scrutiny and complaint, through a performance of attentiveness that masked her desire for control. But now that facade was cracking in front of an entire room of witnesses. The board finally ended their review. They called for a brief recess, leaving the room buzzing with speculation. People gathered in small groups, processing what they had seen. Some exchanged knowing looks. Others openly discussed the footage, reaffirming what they all understood, that the fabricated image would have passed as truth if not for the undeniable evidence presented. When the board returned, the atmosphere had changed completely. The room no longer felt like a tribunal prepared to judge a rule-breaker. It felt instead like a reckoning for the one who had attempted to manipulate the system. The neighbor looked smaller now, diminished by the truth that hovered in the air as heavily as the tension had earlier. The board signaled that they had reached a conclusion, and although they had yet to announce it, everyone could feel the shift. The fabricated violation had imploded. The lie had been exposed, and the consequences were about to unfold. And as the neighbors quieted, leaning in with collective anticipation, the homeowner braced himself. The night was far from over. The real outcome, the flip of the entire HOA, was just beginning to take shape. The final stage of the meeting unfolded with a silence so dense it felt like something physical pressing against the walls of the community center. Every resident sat poised, eyes fixed on the HOA board, as they prepared to deliver a verdict that would ripple through Maple Crest Estates more powerfully than any previous dispute. The fabricated violation was no longer a question of misunderstanding. It was a calculated act, exposed in front of the entire neighborhood. And now, the consequences had arrived. The board members exchanged glances, each face marked with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. They were not accustomed to handling such blatant misconduct from residents. Violations usually involved overgrown grass or improperly stored trash cans, not digital forgeries crafted to frame someone. Yet here they were, confronting an act that undermined the very authority they prided themselves on. When the chairperson finally broke the silence, the room leaned in as if pulled by a single breath. The board announced their findings clearly. The photograph submitted as evidence was falsified. It did not reflect reality. It did not match the dates. It did not align with any recorded conditions of the homeowner's yard. And more importantly, its submission constituted a deliberate attempt to misuse the HOA system. A collective exhale washed across the room. It was subtle but unmistakable, an entire community acknowledging that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. The consequences were outlined carefully. The neighbor who submitted the edited photo would face formal censure from the HOA, including a probationary period during which her ability to submit complaints would be limited. She would also be responsible for covering administrative fees associated with the investigation and meeting. It was a moderate punishment, but within the world of Maple Crest, where reputation and influence mattered more than money, it was devastating. The neighbor's expression crumbled in real time. Her shoulders sank, her posture deflated, and her eyes darted around the room as if searching desperately for even a single supportive face. But none met her gaze. Where she once commanded fearful respect through sheer persistence and meddling, she now sat alone, surrounded by the weight of her own actions. The residents who once tolerated her vigilance had just witnessed her downfall, and their silence told her everything she needed to know. The board then shifted their attention to the homeowner, expressing gratitude for his calm handling of the situation and his willingness to provide clear evidence. They officially removed the violation from his record and apologized for the inconvenience caused. Though the apology was brief and formal, it was something rarely given by a group that seldom admitted error. As the official meeting concluded, the room erupted into quiet conversation. Residents drifted toward the homeowner, offering nods of acknowledgement, sympathetic smiles, or subtle gestures of support. The quiet admiration from people who had watched him be wrongly accused was understated but meaningful. In neighborhoods governed by strict rules and stricter enforcers, small acts of solidarity meant everything. Meanwhile, the disgraced neighbor made her way toward the exit, moving quickly and rigidly, hoping to escape before anyone could confront her. But her shame lingered in the air, the unmistakable mark of someone who had tried to manipulate the system and been caught in the most public way possible. The power she once held through intimidation dissolved like mist as the crowd thinned. The homeowner stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the hum of distant traffic replaced the chatter of the community center. He paused on the walkway, taking a moment to reflect on how rapidly things had escalated. What began as an absurd violation notice had turned into a web of deceit, surveillance, digital manipulation, and ultimately public exposure. In that moment, he realized something deeper. The incident had not just been about a fake photo or a petty neighbor. It had been about control, hers over him, the HOA's over everyone, and the residents over nothing at all. And when he brought the footage to the meeting, he had done something that few in Maple Crest dared to do. He didn't just defend himself. He challenged the system that allowed such behavior to thrive. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood gradually settled back into its routine, but not without noticeable changes. The disgraced neighbor retreated from her usual patrols. Her once daily habit of monitoring lawns and documenting trivial details faded entirely. She stopped attending HOA meetings. Her porch lights, once always on as if she were on watch, now remained off early into the night. The community adjusted too. Residents who had once feared her scrutiny now walked their dogs with a lighter step. Parents let their children play outside without feeling observed. The homeowners who had felt trapped by constant oversight now chatted openly in their driveways without glancing over their shoulders. A small but significant freedom returned to Maple Crest. The HOA board, stung by the embarrassment of being deceived, shifted its tone as well. They became more cautious, more thorough, and noticeably less authoritarian. Reports were no longer accepted without verification. Complaints were cross-checked, and the board members, somewhat humbled, began evaluating not just evidence but intent. The fabricated photo had forced them to confront a flaw in their leadership, and though they would never openly admit it, they had learned from the experience. The homeowner, meanwhile, found himself quietly respected. Neighbors approached him more often, whether to greet him, discuss yard care, or simply acknowledge that he had stood up for himself, and, in a way, for everyone. His security camera, once installed solely for practical reasons, became a symbol of integrity in the neighborhood's ever-watchful environment. Months later, the HOA hosted its annual community gathering, a cheerful event that usually involved grilled food, generic music, and awkward small talk. This year felt different, more relaxed, more authentic, and though the disgraced neighbor attended briefly, she remained on the outskirts, no longer the focal point of attention. Her presence had diminished to that of a reminder, an example of what happened when someone pushed 2FA.by then. The story of the fabricated photo had already become neighborhood folklore. People referenced it jokingly. Others used it to caution newcomers about the importance of documenting everything in Maple Crest. But beneath the humor and retellings was an undercurrent of real change. A line had been drawn, and the community had learned to recognize the difference between vigilance and manipulation. As for the homeowner, he resumed his quiet routines, tending his yard with the same care he always had. His lawn remained neatly trimmed, his walkway swept, his driveway orderly. But now, when he looked around the neighborhood, he felt not the scrutiny that once loomed over every action, but a newfound sense of ease. He had navigated the minefield of HOA politics, faced down a manipulative neighbor, and come out not only vindicated but stronger. And so Maple Crest Estates continued on, still neat, still rule-bound, still governed by the HOA, but with a shifted balance. The illusion of perfection had been shattered, and in its place stood a community that had learned, at least in part, to value fairness over control. The fabricated photo had been meant to incriminate him. Instead, it had exposed the truth.